You're listening to the Rethreading Madness podcast, which airs live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. We are recorded and produced on the unceded traditional territories of the Squamish, Musqueam, and Tsleil-Waututh nations around Vancouver, BC. I'm your host, Bernadine Fox, and this is the show that dares to change how we think about mental health. Welcome to our show.
I've never been further from knowing what the hell I'm gonna do when I can't seem to find my way under or over or through. Just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright.
You're listening to Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM. I'm Bernadine Fox, and this is Rethreading Madness. Today we are talking to a mother who lost her son a day after his 18th birthday to a fentanyl overdose. Her child was one of 1,782 lives lost here in Vancouver to a drug overdose in the first 10 months of 2021. And then shortly thereafter, she lost another child who was a part of her family to the same drug. Fentanyl is found in 81% of all deaths by drug overdose. It is up to 50 times stronger than heroin and 100 times stronger than morphine. And now we have a new form of fentanyl on the street called carfentanil that is 100 times stronger than the fentanyl that has already killed so many of those who struggle with substances. Helen Thomas is a registered counselor. She has extensive experience providing both group and individual therapy to those struggling with trauma, addictions, abuse, depression, and anxiety. She's there for folks who are in need of guidance through life's challenging transitions. Helen is also a mom who takes the job of motherhood seriously and embraces it with joy. I know, I have watched her do this as her family stretched from 2 babies to 5+1. It makes this story all the more tragic. Helen, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me.
It's a hard topic. And just for our listeners, just so you know, Helen and I are basically family. We're not blood family, but we are family. Mm-hmm. And Helen's here to talk about a very difficult issue, as we talked about in the intro. So I want everybody to know that some of this material may be triggering, and to make sure you take care of yourself in this hour so that you're going to be okay. A tough issue. Mm-hmm. Thank you for coming.
Yeah.
Helen, when you were pregnant, I remember actually, I was realizing today that I actually met you. Mika was a baby, I think, in your arms. Mm. So Malachy would have been six. Yeah, running around. I think it was up on the that festival that used to happen in North Bend.
Oh, yeah, under the volcano.
Under the volcano.
Yeah.
Ace was singing there that day.
Yeah, I remember.
Yeah, and and so I was thinking about, when we're pregnant and we have babies, we have all kinds of ideas that rarely turn out to be true, but we have a lot of ideas about what that looks like. What are they going to, we have ideas about where they're going to live and who they're going to become and what are they going to be like. And we may not be so neurotic as to think they're all going to be lawyers or doctors, but ideas of them being happy and healthy and living their potential. What did you think when you were pregnant with Malachy and Mika was born? What did you see as the future for your 2 boys?
Well, it was different between the 2 of them. When I had Malachy, I was 24, and nowhere near ready to be any kind of a parent. It was, I struggled to take care of myself, let alone a baby. Mm-hmm. And I really quickly had to change my lifestyle around. We were, my partner and I were quite street entrenched at the time. So there was substance use and a lot of homeless people around, that kind of thing. And when I got pregnant, I really wanted to keep him. My family offered to take the baby. My oldest sister offered to take the baby and raise him. And I really wanted to keep him, and I really wanted to raise him myself and have him be a functioning member of society and, you know, somebody really special. And he was somebody really special.
Yes, he was.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. It just didn't turn out the way that I had intended. And that started really early on with my birth story that I had with him, where I had an emergency C-section and all kinds of birth trauma from that. And I feel like that really interrupted my ability to attach to him. So it wasn't at all what I imagined. I started having panic attacks and intrusive thoughts before even leaving the hospital. And that was not something I had experienced before.
Motherhood does change us. You know, you go from being this sort of carefree, well, your version of carefree, my version of carefree, to somebody who is suddenly responsible for another whole other human being. And I don't think for me that's ever left. I mean, I still find myself raising my grandchild who's now 22 and feeling like, oh, geez, maybe I didn't tell them this. Maybe I need to tell them this little thing over here. And of course it's always, you've already told me that like 100 times, but you know, the panic is still there. You know, that's your job. Your job is to somehow create this person's life in such a way that they are ready to take on life and be an adult in whatever capacity they want to be that adult. So
yes, I felt extremely responsible, and responsible for him, and not just because I had chosen to have him under, you know, maybe not the best circumstances, but I think a lot of people felt like I was going to fail at parenting him. And it was really important to me that I not fail at that. Yeah.
So he also experienced some trauma as a child.
Yeah.
And of course, we always look at that in terms of, you know, what happens in our kids' lives that is you know, pushes them in one direction or another. Do you feel that the trauma he experienced, do you want to describe that trauma?
Sure. Yeah. I was actually thinking about it today that Malachy and I actually did the ACEs scale together at one point.
Right. And just so people know, the ACEs scale is, you can describe it, you're a counselor.
It's the Adverse Childhood Experiences Scale. So it's a measure of what children might experience as complex PTSD or complex trauma.
Right.
I can't remember all of them, but I know he had most, other than childhood sexual abuse and physical abuse.
Right.
So I think that tells you quite a bit about his childhood. But the biggest factor, I feel like, for him was that he witnessed a lot of domestic violence. And it shaped him, who he became. And I think also how he felt about himself as a man, which became problematic as he started to move towards adulthood.
How do you think it impacted his idea of who he was as a man? What does that look like?
Well, Malachy, he did the very best he could to not be like his biological father. He tried to separate himself as much as he could from somebody who might be violent with women particularly. And he became, I'm very proud of him for this, but I think it was sort of in the wrong context, but he became sort of a street vigilante. And anytime there was a young woman or somebody here on the downtown east side that was in distress, he would intervene in a way where he would sometimes get into physical altercations with other men. And he was just a boy.
Yes.
But it was really important to him that not play out in front of him again. But I also think that he learned very early on to dissociate. And I know he was taught at a very young age to lock himself in the bathroom when things started to get scary. And I think that ability to sort of leave his body when things started to get dangerous was maybe replicated in his drug use.
So do you think that when did he start using?
He started when he was 14. That I know of. So I don't know everything that happened, but my understanding is that he started when he was 14, and he started with smoking weed and drinking alcohol. Yeah. I don't know. It's a hard thing to explain, I think, but because of where I came from and my concerns about Malachy's future, I felt like I purposefully inoculated him or attempted to inoculate him against addiction. So it was a conversation that we had from the time he could understand what I was saying to him. We had many, many friends that he saw deteriorate, that he saw die. And I was very straightforward. This is what happens with addiction, right? That it can happen to anybody, and you have to be really careful, especially when there's genetic potential. And I always kind of, I don't know, it hurts me in a weird way when I see the ads on TV that says talk to your kids about drugs, because
it's not going to solve the issue.
Yeah, I did that.
Right.
You know, probably maybe a little bit too much even.
Well, as you know, my oldest child has a drug addiction. I have not lost her death-wise, but I certainly have lost her to those drugs. I raised the oldest grandchild, and I overcompensated and made her promise me every day as a little tiny tyke that she would not use drugs. Just promise me you won't use drugs. It was just too hard for me to imagine going through that again. And I mean, she doesn't, but I don't think my constantly saying, please promise me, did anything but annoy her, quite frankly. I don't think that, and I'm not an expert necessarily on I'm just not an expert on drug addiction, but I don't think that we can talk addiction out of our children. That's my sense about it. I mean, I think about my oldest now, and I can remember her at the age of 4, finding her under a table with a tablecloth on it. So she was hidden underneath the table, and she'd gone in there with a bottle of wine that had been sitting out. We were socializing, and there she was under the table drinking this bottle of wine at the age of 4. And I remember her also doing that with a bottle when she was about 18 months old. And I thought it was funny at the time, like, ha, you shouldn't be doing that. But it was empty, and it wasn't like I was feeding her booze. But now I look back at those times, and I see them as huge red flags that this was somebody who was searching for something to feel normal with.
To soothe, to self-soothe.
Did Malachy do anything like that?
Never. Never. And I, of course, this has made me call into question all my ideas about parenting, which has left me, somewhat lost, because I felt like, despite what Malachy and I had gone through, that I'd done a really good job with him. And I still feel that. I know that sounds maybe kind of strange because he's not with us anymore, but I felt like, and my philosophy was that if I set this foundation of attachment with him, that he and I stay close, our relationship stay close, that he'd be okay. And when he turned about 13, 14, I kind of turned him loose into the community and into his life. And I regret that now, but I had so much confidence that he wasn't going to end up where he ended up. Yeah. So it came as a real shock to me when things started to happen, when hospitals started to call or the police started to show up at the door. I was just, what is happening here? Because it wasn't what I expected from him at all. He wanted to go to UBC and be a physicist.
Wow.
Yeah.
I did not know that about Malachy.
Yeah,
wow.
So he had a nickname, Quanti, which was short for quantum. And I called him that until the day he died. I called him Quanti.
I just think that
Yeah.
as parents, we're not as powerful as we have been led to believe.
Yes,
And,
absolutely.
that we
Yeah.
can do the best we can and try and keep our children as safe as possible. And drugs are made to be addictive. That's how they make them. They make them increasingly to be more addictive, faster addictive.
Yeah.
All of those things. And I think that part of it isn't given enough airtime around addiction, that we tend to think that it's all about trauma and abuse of children, and they grow up and use drugs to get away. And I think that that's a part of it, but there's this other part of it that I think is huge, and that is that it's a business, and drug dealers make drugs to be addictive. And
Yeah, and I think there's also sort of a culture of addiction that is attractive to young people. And Malachy and I talked about this so many times, I can't even tell you, but when he was young and started getting into drugs, he started shifting his interests from, we were primarily a punk rock metal family, into more rap hip hop culture. And I see now, with the kids I'm still raising, and my oldest daughter likes these rappers as well, and they're dying one after the other of their addiction. But a lot of the music talks about drugs that I had never even really contemplated using, like drinking codeine with pop. And
oh my God, I feel very old at the moment.
That was one of the first things that the hospital called me, because that's what Malachy had taken, and the hospital didn't even know what it was. She handed me the bottle. I took a picture of it and sent it to a friend, and he said, "This is liquid codeine. They mix it with 7-Up. The rappers do this commonly. They call it lean." I can hear Malachy laughing at me in my head, like, that's so lame. But and like Xanax, bars of Xanax, it's part of the culture.
Wow.
And of course, Malachy and I have had many, many conversations about oppression and genocide, and who's actually pulling the strings with these artists.
Right.
And they're all dying one after the other.
One
and
just died recently.
Yes, that's right. Yeah, but it has been, I know there's like Little Peep and Little this and Little that or whatever, but I mean, it's genocide, and Malachy and I talked about that a lot, and I know he internalized it because his counselor told me that he told her about that, which was a conversation Malachy and I had.
So here you have this boy, you have all these hopes and dreams. He's going to become a physicist, and then suddenly around 13, 14, did you say, he's starting to use more and more drugs, and you're hearing more and more from hospitals and police.
Yeah.
Because why? Because he was getting into trouble? Was he ODing or?
He was, the first time the hospital called me, he had tried to jump in front of the SkyTrain. So there was some question about suicidality, but he had also been extremely aggressive with the doctors and staff, and had to be tranquilized and restrained. And he would have very little memory of these incidents. He didn't remember what had happened. So that was the first one. And I very quickly learned that I wasn't getting any help from anybody.
Ouch. Okay, we're going to come right back, folks, but don't go away. I want to know more about what that means, that nobody's helping. You're listening to Rethreading Madness. I'm Bernadine Fox, and I'm talking with Helen Thomas, who is a mom who most recently in the last 16 months has lost her own biological child, Malachy, to drugs, and a child who was also a part of their family very recently died from a drug overdose as well, Liam. Helen, you said that there was no help. What does that mean?
Well, there were a series of hospitalizations that Malachy had when he would overdose or get himself into some kind of trouble. So I'll explain it this way. Okay. The first time I picked him up from the hospital, he was 14 or 15. He was being guarded by a security guard. He was restrained. He had been tranquilized. He had tried to jump in front of the SkyTrain. When I showed up, they showed me the bottle that they had found on him. Then they undid his restraints and sent him home with his mom. He immediately went in the wrong direction. He was angry. He came home and slept and woke up and said, "Where the fuck are my drugs?" And that was the beginning, but it never ever stopped there. I had that experience many, many times. He once punched his way out of Children's Hospital, punching the glass, punching the walls as he left.
This is after he's been discharged?
After he's been
really
discharged.
Mad.
Yeah. So as soon
That's
as...
actually very common.
Yeah,
think,
but as soon as I would arrive, they would release him to me. And it was very hard for me to know what to do next, especially since I had other children at home that were young. Malachy's behavior was extremely erratic, with my own abuse history and trauma history. I felt frightened of him at times, even though he never raised a hand to me, never called me a name. He was always extremely respectful, but there was, when he'd look at me, sometimes I don't think he even recognized who I was.
Wow. Did he get treatment?
Eventually he did. Yeah, eventually he did. So, at one point, gosh, I guess he was about 16. Everybody kind of colluded in telling Malachy that what he was doing was killing him. So his girlfriend Riley said, "We're over." His friend said, "We're not hanging out with you anymore." I said, "You can't live here anymore." Which was a heartbreaking decision to make.
No kidding.
So he went and lived in the McDonald's for like 2 days or something like that. And then the police called me and said, he says he can't come home. And I said, he can come home, but he needs to go to detox and then to treatment. And that took 2 tries through detox. And then he finally went to treatment, and he did exceptionally well there.
And is it easy to get into detox quickly? Because I keep hearing that it's hard, and then they get out of detox, and then they have to stay clean until they get to treatment, and that's this sort of...
There was a gap.
Starts falling apart.
That's exactly right. There was a gap between detox and treatment, which was... It took a lot of fortitude on his part, because there were... I don't know. It wasn't that long. It was only a few days, but still Malachy was very vulnerable. But yeah, he did a 10-week residential treatment program. He did extremely well there. He managed to catch up in high school on what he had missed, because of course he had been bounced from one school to another.
Right.
And we all thought that he was on the right track. They actually asked him to come back to the residential treatment program to run groups.
Wow. Because
he was so well versed in addiction, the history of drugs, the drug war, the politics behind it. Like I said, this was a common conversation in our home. And then the pandemic hit. And I feel like that sped everything up towards losing him. Well, everything sort of shut down, right? Yes. So he wasn't back at, he couldn't go back to the treatment program to do the groups. They shut that down. A lot of the NA groups and AA groups in the community were stopped and were done just virtually. And also, no school, no work. He had an apprenticeship set up for BCIT for carpentry. It was delayed by a year, and then it was delayed by another year. So this is a boy who's aimless. Yeah. So, yeah, I mean, that was one thing. And then the other thing that I harbor a lot of guilt about, because of course I was worried about COVID, is I I didn't want him to have anybody at the house. I didn't want him to bring people home with him. And of course he did. You know, I let myself a bit off the hook because I could never really tell Malachy what to do. You know, he would sort of agree with me and bat his eyes at me and, no, Mama, I would never do that. And then, you know, off he'd go and do exactly the opposite. But when he died alone. And I worry that he didn't, you know, maybe he would have lived another day if there had have been a friend with him.
So let's talk about his death. What happened?
So Malachy had a relapse 6 months before his 18th birthday, so December 2020, and it was a bad one. He had intentionally used fentanyl. Fortunately, an old friend who he had done martial arts with for 10 years, the 10 years he did martial arts, was with him, and managed to do CPR until the ambulance came, and they naloxoned him several times and put him on the ventilator to breathe for him. I got there because this friend called my daughter, and by the time I got there, Malachy was on his feet and angry. I didn't overdose. What are you doing here?
I hear that's very common.
Yeah, I know how to handle my drugs. And from what I understood, he hadn't been using before then. Since treatment and that relapse. But like I said, I don't really know. But we thought that we convinced him to go to the hospital with the ambulance, and then my daughter and I came around the corner and she starts yelling, he's up, he's leaving. So he fled from the ambulance. And I guess now there's a policy amongst the police that they have to go and get somebody who's under 18 who's overdosed, because of course the naloxone wears off. He would overdose again and die in an alley. So they arrested him. They took him to the hospital. I will never forget this moment that he sat in this plastic chair with the police around him in handcuffs and looked at me and mouthed, "I'm sorry, Mama."
Yeah.
But again, they released him. And no follow-up. Nothing. He was 17 years old. And I believe, because there had been so many overdoses prior to the final one, I was told by the coroner that there was probably heart damage, and I believe that. But I just wish that somebody had have told me that. Like, I don't know how much it would have changed, but you know, maybe I would have been more on top of him.
I did not know that overdosing does cause heart damage. It kind of makes sense. Your heart stops.
Yeah. And then the 6 months after that, I thought, because that's, I guess, what I wanted to believe, that he was doing really well. Like, he was up and at them in the morning and out all day. And I knew he was selling drugs, because a friend of mine who worked at the Carnegie said, just a heads up, but your kid's on the front steps of the Carnegie every day. So
does that mean he's selling? On the steps?
Well, I guess that meant he was up to something.
Right.
But that's what he was doing. And the only way I found out that that's what he was doing, because of course there were two ways I found out. One is that our neighbors have video cameras in our alley and said, "You have a drug dealer in your house."
Wow. Oh my God.
Which made me extremely concerned for the smaller children,
right,
and their safety, and Malachy's safety, and our safety. And then he sold, his friend's father called me and said, "My son overdosed. He's in the hospital. They don't know if there's going to be brain damage." Ouch. And I thought he called me just as sort of support because they were friends. And then he texted me screenshots that Malachy had sold him the drugs.
Oh my gosh.
So his parents managed to kick in the door and resuscitate him.
Wow.
But if they hadn't, he would have died.
Wow.
And Malachy would have been responsible.
Yes.
So,
how is that for you?
Awful,
Yeah.
terrible.
Yeah.
Because I think, I mean, my understanding of selling drugs now is a little bit different. I've shifted my perspective slightly, but when we were growing up, and what I taught Malachy is that drug dealers are bad people. They're not good people. They're trying to, some of them, most of them are probably trying to meet their own demand for supply.
Yeah.
But lots of them are getting rich off of people's suffering and pain. And who sells fentanyl to a 14-year-old kid?
Yes. Yeah.
Like somebody really diabolical and really bad and really selfish. And I tried to teach Malachy a very anti-capitalist understanding of the world.
Right.
We support each other. Community is important. We take care of those who are vulnerable.
Yeah.
You go to a rally, you have privilege, you're a young, white, able, cis-het man. You stand in between neo-Nazis and the indigenous women. You stand in between the police and the indigenous women. And so when I knew that he was doing this, I felt extremely betrayed, extremely confused. And I said, why? I didn't raise you to be like this. And he said, you raised me to be exactly like this.
Oh.
He said, why would I want to be like you? You have a master's degree, 2 university degrees. You're $100,000 in debt, and we still live in poverty.
So he was tying success into money. Yeah.
But what he wanted to do, which was just so counter, he wanted to buy a hotel to house homeless people. So that's what he was saving his money for, was to buy a hotel to provide housing for people on the downtown east side who didn't have a place to go. And I think that was a big part of the appeal of selling drugs and what he was doing. And I was told by a variety of different people that he would have a lineup of people waiting, not just because they wanted to buy from him, but because they wanted to talk to him, because he would sit and listen to their stories.
Wow.
And he would come home at night and say, Mama, can you make me some tea? I'd make him some tea, and he'd tell me the stories of the people on the downtown east side and how important they were to him, and how surprised he was by their inability to see their own worth. But I think I've struggled with that, and I think he struggled with that too.
I think it's hard to come out of a childhood that has any kind of trauma in it because and see your own self-worth. I think we all struggle with that just because we're taught that if something bad happens to you, it's because you're bad.
Of course.
That's it.
Of course.
Bottom line.
Yeah. Or if there's something wrong with your parents, right? It's too scary to think my parents maybe can't take care of me. It's not what's wrong with them. It's what's wrong. It must be something about me as the child, because to think, it's life or death when you're a little tiny nervous system, right?
It's true. That is true. We just need to take a little break, but we're going to come back and we're going to talk a little bit more about what happens when you lose a child to drugs. So don't go away, folks. So Malachy, as much as I've known Malachy for a while, I did not know these things about Malachy. It gives me a whole different perspective on who he was. By the time I came along, he was, I think he was probably 12 or 13, and really not into hanging out with old people.
Yeah.
So I didn't know these stories about Malachy, and I'm really appreciate knowing them. Thank you
Yeah.
for telling me.
Yeah.
So Malachy has been gone for 16 months, and you just lost another child to drugs.
Yeah. Yeah.
What happens to a parent at this point? Like, where I know you're questioning your ability to parent, and I do
Yes.
know from looking at you and looking at what you have been to the children in your family who are part of my family, it has been a godsend. So anytime you need to know you're a good parent,
Oh, thank you.
just come and ask me. So, but what does it do to you? And I don't ask this out of some sort of nasty,
I know.
voyeurism, but I think
Yeah.
there are so many of us that have lost a child to drugs.
Yeah, I feel like, I feel like I've been fighting a war. And that was the addiction, and I've lost that war. And I feel somewhat like I don't know, it might sound like hyperbole, I guess, but I just feel like I've been eviscerated. I don't know how else to describe it, and I'm just trying to walk around holding my organs back in some semblance of functioning.
You actually said that the day Malachy died.
Did I?
Yeah, that's what you said.
I don't remember that.
Yeah.
I don't remember much from that time.
Mm-hmm.
I remember staring at the wall for hours and hours and hours. I remember very early morning panic attacks.
Mm-hmm.
I remember grief dreams of searching, like that, that feeling when you lose your kid in the store and there's this
Yes.
panic.
Yes.
Like that, but not finding them again. And I think I've had some pretty dark times where I felt like I wanted to die.
Mm-hmm.
I didn't want to go on living without him, and didn't know how to go on living without him. Felt like maybe my other kids were better off without me if this was my best. My best as a parent, and I couldn't help him. I couldn't save him. And then you throw into that being a therapist, right? Like,
Yeah.
one of the flowers I got when Malachy died was from a family who I've seen all of their daughters, all their girls. And she said in the note, you saved my kids. And I just thought, why couldn't I do that for this like most precious person to me? And I think, like, it was probably a lot of pressure on Malachy too, that he was like, I saw him as this sort of culmination of everything good about me. Everything good that I had achieved in my life was like walking around in the world. And I just kept on seeing over and over and over again in him the parts of me that I hadn't healed. The
Right.
first time he was arrested, he was sitting on the curb in handcuffs wearing my hoodie.
Oh my.
And I just sort of shocked.
Right.
Like, yeah, just such a bizarre experience. But yeah, and then it's been really, really perplexing to me how I can physically go on living, like how my heart didn't stop beating at the same time that his did. It just, to me, blows my mind
Yeah.
how I carried him in my womb, like.
There's actually a scientific paper out that says that you don't just carry babies in your womb, but as they are there, their cells slough off and that they become a part of you.
And they repair heart damage.
Yes. Yeah, you saw that.
I know, I'm aware, yeah.
So you do still carry
Yeah.
Malachy.
Yeah.
It's not separate from you.
Yeah.
but it certainly is very different than having the person
Yes,
in front
of
of you,
course.
the child that you can look at and touch and hug. And
Yeah, and I've had to do a lot of work around that, around what my relationship is like with him moving forward. It's been really complicated, and I've been really angry at him, at the system, at our government, at his father, at a lot of things. And yeah, and I'll just tell you, I mean, of course you know this, but Malachy died the day after his 18th birthday. So
Yes.
he had gone out on the night of his 18th birthday, and I was angry because he was sick. And I didn't, again, with the COVID, I didn't want him out gallivanting around. I was also sick. I felt very pressed in bed by a fever. And he texted me very early in the morning, maybe 3 or 4 in the morning, and said that he was out graffitiing and would be home soon. And I had a really bad feeling that things weren't okay in his room. And I remember thinking to myself, I just want one more evening where things are normal. And then I went down to his room, and he was dead in his bed, in his pajamas.
wow. I can't even imagine finding a child in their bed where they're supposed to be safe
Yeah.
in your home that you've created
Yeah.
to protect and house and nurture them.
I can't unhear my own screaming
Yeah.
for him. But at the same time, I had this sense that his body was just like this coat that he had taken off and left on the floor. And I kind of wondered for a long time, like, where did you go? I will still sometimes say, Malachy, please come home, as I'm going to sleep at night. Because he always came home, Bernie. Unless something really bad happened, he always came home.
Right.
And he loved us, and he loved his siblings, and
How are they doing?
well, it's been a lot, and now we've lost Liam, so that's 2 siblings for them in 16 months.
And there's been other people around you that have also died
Yeah.
for various reasons.
Yeah. Yeah.
So there's been a lot in
Yeah.
your life and your kids' lives right now.
Yeah, a lot.
Yeah.
And I don't know. I mean, everybody's getting a variety of different professional help. But I just, I wish that people who don't understand addiction and don't understand the notions of harm reduction or safe supply could understand that we're not just trying to save the addicted person, but that this has generational impact.
Yes.
So not just Malachy, not just Liam, but the rest of my children and their children and their children are going to be impacted by these losses.
Yeah.
And the cost of it,
It's huge.
the professional services that we are all going to need for the rest of our lives to be able to cope with this trauma, it would so much better be spent, right? Dealing with the original issue or the original trauma or
Do you think they know how to deal with drug addiction? Like,
no,
my
I
sense
don't.
is that they don't know how to fix it.
No, I don't think so. But I think, I mean, I have some ideas of what would help. And I know that it's not an overnight solution, and everybody's different. People come to addiction for a variety of different reasons, and people recover for other reasons, and others die, right? But I think that there's a much more compassionate approach.
So are you saying that harm reduction is not compassionate, or needs to be fleshed out more so that it has more compassion in it.
Yeah, I think that a combination of things need to happen. So there's like there's a quote I think about Desmond Tutu quote, and I don't know if I'm saying it right, but he says, you know, basically we need to stop fishing people out from the bottom of the river and figure out why they're falling in the first place. And I think that that's extremely important. And, you know, I think about critical points in Malachy's life where an intervention or where things could have been different that might have helped,
Right.
you know, because of displacement in trying to live in Vancouver. And I was trying very hard to keep them connected with a sense of community. We moved 6 times in 5 years. Sometimes we didn't have heat. We had a raccoon crash in through our ceiling once.
Yikes.
Yeah, like all kinds of really difficult things that we know can be traumatic for a child, let alone the domestic violence that he witnessed, the addiction that was around him, those losses. And then when he became involved with the criminal justice system, there was he was abused by the police. And I think that was another critical point where things could have been different for him.
Yeah, it's a very huge betrayal for kids for people to be abused by the police. It's a huge betrayal.
Yeah. And so I think a combination of things. I think harm reduction is definitely a step in the right direction. I also truly believe in a safe supply. I'll tell a really quick story.
Sure.
That my husband was very ill a few weeks ago, and
This is not your husband who is Malachy's father.
this is somebody else. This is my
Okay.
husband now. Ben was very ill and in pain and vomiting and pain, abdominal pain, and on his hands and knees. And the ambulance, it was an hour and a half since I had called the ambulance and they still weren't coming. And I thought, if I had some morphine, I would give it to this man to relieve his suffering. And I think anybody compassionate would, but the thing is that we can't see trauma in the same way that we can see a physical ailment.
That's right.
When
we
you
don't.
see people at Crab Park, it's like if their arms and legs were broken and you know, or they were bleeding, and sometimes they are, of course, we would feel compelled to provide pain relief.
Yes.
And so I really believe that people need to survive from one day to the next. You can't recover if you're dead.
No.
You can't get help if you're dead. And the opportunity to have a safe supply. I mean, I know it's kind of a radical idea, but there's some great groups in the downtown east side doing a lot of work around this. To be able to go into a pharmacy and get your drug of choice that has been tested, you know, is safe and is, you know, geared towards income. If you're making a lot of money and you have a cocaine problem.
Just like pharmacare is.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. It's compassionate care. And then you take care of a lot of other things, crime, violence. We definitely need more mental health services. I, as a therapist, have taken my clients myself to the emergency room because I had concerns about their safety, and they have been sent home.
Ugh.
So
There's also, in terms of harm reduction, I think that we need to be doing more for children of drug addicts.
Yes.
And this is my little beef in that my daughter had a drug addiction. She had a child. She was given lots. Her child was simply ignored and cut off.
Absolutely.
And there does not seem, as much as they say, is there 4 pillars or 5 pillars? 4? I don't know. But the prevention one is not really enacted. And so what we're really doing is we're leaving children of drug addicts who don't have somebody who's taking them in and taking care of them. We're leaving them to fend for themselves. And they are going to remodel the coping skills of their parents and start using drugs, and they become the next generation of drug addicts.
Of course. And if you somehow find yourself addicted to drugs and you don't have trauma by some miracle, you're going to have it in that life. I can't even imagine how many people are down here with head injuries
Right.
that have been just dismissed from the hospital with no care. And then, you know, I mean, we all know how that goes, right? You're given medicine at the hospital, or the doctors give you medicine. Just an average person, you've had a surgery, they say, we're not giving it to you anymore. Where do you go? What do you do?
Right.
You know, you have some kind of unbearable emotional pain. You lose a child.
Yes.
How do you cope, right?
How do you cope?
And
it's okay if you don't.
Yeah, no, I mean, I do. I have learned a lot over the past 16 months, and I think I've never been so close to being a hippie in my entire life, because I'm not a passive person. I believe in direct action, but I've had to develop and work on a sense of spirituality, life after death, what I think that means. And that's, fortunately, or maybe unfortunately, I'm not sure, but made things different for me when Liam died. Because I see Liam as having been released from their body that was in a lot of pain and a lot of distress.
Yes.
But again, you know, Liam was one of our best ones. Liam was an Indigenous land defender and really believed in protecting the earth, and believed in an anti-oppressive philosophy, and they taught me a tremendous amount about that. And I'll never forget Liam looking at me and saying, "Weaponize your privilege."
Yes.
It's
a very, very important thing to do.
It really, really meant
I like that phrase.
a
Thank
lot
you,
to
Liam.
me. Yeah.
Yes.
But I can't help but think that this is sort of being allowed to happen, right? Black people, Indigenous people, people involved in social justice who use drugs for whatever reason, I don't care, are being allowed to die in the alley and on the street.
Do you think maybe that's because we have to stop very soon here?
Yeah.
So it's probably the wrong question to ask at the end of the interview. But do you think it's partially because they don't know how to help?
I would like to think that. I think that there's, I think in general, people don't have an understanding of addiction. They don't have an understanding of trauma. And this, goes back forever about the whole, pull yourself up by the bootstraps expression, right? Which was kind of ironic now because you actually can't.
No, especially if you don't have boots.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, so I think there has to be a real turning of the tide in how educated the general public is, and I think Gabor Mate is a good example of this, of what the work that he's done to inform people and have them understand what this means and how we can intervene in an early way. But the whole system that we're in a colonized community. This is a colonized system, and there's capitalism and patriarchy and racism and ableism and all kinds of other things going on that directly impact the lives of addicts.
Yes, and leave them to die. Yes, we have to stop here. I'm so sorry, Helen.
No,
But thank you so much for coming in and chatting with me about this very important topic.
Thank you for having me. I just want to say on a last note that for me and I'm sure for other people who have lost their children, sometimes people don't want to talk about it or don't want to bring it up. There's not 1 second of 1 minute of one day that I am not aware that I've lost these children.
Yes.
Nobody can remind me of it.
Yeah.
So let's talk about it.
Yeah. Well, I'm glad you're here doing that. I'm going to hug you.
Okay.
And we'll be right back, folks. I'm Bernadine Fox, and you've been listening to Rethreading Madness. For a parent, losing a child is devastating. From the moment they are born, they are a part of you. They have changed your world. All things now start with thinking of that child. They're done in support of raising that child, and any plans you make are done with a view to what is best for that child. By the time they are 18, as Malachy was, their removal from one's life leaves a gaping hole that cannot be filled by anything, not an activity, not another child, not work. This hole, as Helen so aptly described, is never-ending with no defined edges. Losing a child to an addiction is further traumatizing. We are told that we are to protect our children, but protecting them from something so easily available to them in a society that has literally no safeguards or programs to assist them or you in this huge role is a recipe for disaster. We are losing our children. And to conclude that a parent must do better is just not the answer. We are just not that powerful. Certainly not in the face of a dearth of resources to help our children. Vancouver has a 4-pillar approach to the drug problem. They are harm reduction, prevention, treatment, and enforcement. The pillar I mentioned previously was prevention. Once upon a time, it was described as basically preventing drug use from happening. As it is now described, it is preventing harm, which seems to overlap with another pillar, harm reduction. Preventing children from using doesn't seem to appear in the 4-pillar roster of activities, and statistically, our children are first offered illegal drugs between the ages of 8 and 11. Without providing support for our children, in my opinion, we are simply creating the next generation of drug addicts to fill the current harm reduction and treatment programs. It is a scary scenario to think about. Now, I'm not an expert, and if I'm wrong in how I have described this situation from my layman's perspective, I would be happy to have my statements contradicted. Call or write me, fill me in. I want to thank Helen Thomas for coming in and sharing this very personal story with us, and to Sherry Ulrich for the gift of her music. But as always, more importantly, my thanks goes out to you for joining us today. Stay safe out there. I'm Bernadine Fox, and you've just listened to Rethreading Madness, the podcast that dares to change how we think about mental health. We air live on Vancouver Co-op Radio, CFRO 100.5 FM, every Tuesday at 5 p.m. or online at coopradio.org. If you have questions or feedback about this program or want to share your story or have something to say to us, we want to hear from you. You can reach us by email, rethreadingmadness@coopradio.org. If you enjoyed this show, subscribe so you don't miss the next episode.
I've never been further from knowing what the hell I'm gonna do when I can't seem to find my way under or over or through. Just when I'm ready to give up the fight, there you are when we turn out the lights, and it's alright, it's alright, don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Yeah. Why don't I wonder how you know? Well, surely you don't have all of the facts. You could be just making it up. Why don't I ever think of that? It's some kind of magic in the words that you breathe, saying, baby, take it from me. It's alright, it's alright, don't you worry, it'll be alright. Why do I always believe it when you tell me everything's gonna be alright? Everything's gonna be alright. With anyone else, it's such a cliche, just words people say